Moving on to our next session, which is on thyroid cancer in the young, I request Dr. Ishita Sen, Director, Nuclear Medicine at Fortis Memorial Research Institute, Gurgaon, to chair the session. Ma'am, please.
So good evening, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this very interesting webinar, web conference. And it is indeed my big fortune to be able to chair this session, which has such stellar speakers. Without wasting any time, I think let me introduce the first speaker, who actually needs no introduction, and it is none other than Dr. Harit Chaturvedi. Dr. Harit Chaturvedi is the chairperson of Max Institute of Cancer Care, surgical oncologist par excellence. He has been almost single-handedly instrumental in bringing the Max Healthcare team of oncology to become one of the biggest and most respectable centers in the country. And he has special interest in the surgical oncology of the young, especially with thyroid cancer. And he has served national bodies like the Indian Society of Oncology and the Indian Association of Surgical Oncology as president. So over to you, Dr. Harit Chaturvedi, sir. I am sure everybody is waiting eagerly to hear from you.
Thank you, Ishita, for that kind introduction and a very elaborate introduction.
Okay, sir. Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Prakash Chitalkar, for having me here this morning, Dr. Indu, and I saw so many friends here. And for giving me this topic on pediatric thyroid cancers, because we know that this is one malignancy where surgeons like me play a role, and we have this is an important problem which needs to be addressed. So it accounts for almost 3% of malignancies in this age group. And it is when a thyroid nodule is there in children, the chances of this being malignant is higher compared to what we see in adult population. And especially if you look at the age group of younger, less than 10 years. Having said that, between 15 and 19 years, it's the eighth most frequent cancer. And in adolescents compared to younger children, 10 times higher in incidence. So this is not an, one second, my screen is not moving. Yeah. So this is something which cannot be ignored. Every pediatrician, every surgeon, everybody who comes across a nodule in this age group should have antennas raised the moment you see a thyroid nodule. And as expected, the most common is papillary CA thyroid. Follicular is less common. And as we know, medullary is something which is more hereditary in nature in this age group and is, though rare, but it raises an alertness that you need to check the syndromes and make sure that we don't miss seeing something which has other adjuvant things happening along with it. And obviously, proliferative thyroid cancer is very uncommon in this age group. Almost we can say not to be seen. Now, the etiology is genetic in medullary. In other cases, we really don't understand so well. Having said that, radiation-induced thyroid malignancies are known. And as we know that the common cause for radiation exposure is lymphoma, leukemia, or CNS tumors, more so for children who are less than 5 years of age. In that age group, the sensitivity of thyroid is very high. If they're exposed to that, then the probability of getting malignancy is high. And the other factors, obviously, is the iodine deficiency and few syndromes, as we know in case of medullary, the MEN syndromes and other things, which is common, and few other syndromes, which are less common, but one should be aware of, is obviously APC-associated polyposis or family FAP, as we call it, or Gardner's syndrome or Turcot. There we see papillary thyroid cancer as part of the syndrome. The Carney complex, again, differentiated thyroid cancer is part of that syndrome, besides having follicular adenomas and other things. Then, as you see here, DSRI for MNG and DTC is known. The P10 syndrome is also something which is differentiated thyroid cancer as part of it, along with hematoma tumor syndrome. So these are few complex syndromes, which if one comes across, it's important to check out both clinically and radiologically that as part of the syndrome, we are not coming across a possibility of a thyroid malignancy. Obviously, patients' history of radiation exposure should be regularly checked and screened to rule out malignancy. Now, what is a workup for a suspicious thyroid nodule? Or in fact, I would say if you pick up a nodule on imaging or on physical examination in a young adult or a teenager or a young in this subset of population. So as is standard practice, that one should go for guided FNAC after checking the thyroid TSH level. If TSH is suppressed, you know it may be hyper-functioning thyroid. In that case, do a nuclear thyroid scintigraphy and then go for guided FNAC. In those which is not suppressed, then straight away go for guided FNAC. But whenever there's a hypoechoic nodule there, then we should go for a FNAC image guided FNAC. If it is benign, then obviously one can keep under close follow-up. And here, close follow-up means repeat ultrasounds every 6 to 12 months and FNAC as it is growing or if there's a suspicious or a new finding. Now, if it is malignant, obviously we know the course, we have to go for surgery and act. If it is suspicious or inadequate, in that case, one should be more than alert. The moment it's suspicious, plan the surgery. If it is inadequate, then keep on even shorter follow-up in these patients, and that could be 3 to 6 monthly ultrasound and FNA. And close follow-up for a couple of years is important before we put our guard down, because this may show up suddenly as metastatic or nodal positive disease, which is not a good idea. So the workup is ultrasound, FNAC, and in cases where there's a large fixed thyroid mass or palsy or something suggests advanced disease, in that case, CT and MRI is definitely indicated to assess the disease locally thoroughly before you plan surgery. Otherwise, an ultrasound and FNAC is good enough to give us the clue what we are dealing with and how to plan about it. Now, as for adults, the planning for surgery for primary here also is total thyroidectomy for majority of our children. And multiple studies show decreased risk of recurrent disease after doing a total thyroidectomy. There are higher chances of multifocal disease and bilateral disease. So the threshold to do total should be low. We should go for total. If it is an instantly picked up papillary thyroid, that is, if you did a hemithyroidectomy because it was known as benign, and then you pick it up, in that case, check the contralateral disease, and completion is only if disease was present in other side or there's some other reason like nodal positivity or you want to go for therapy, only in that case. Otherwise, hemi in that select group can be observed. And as for all situations, if the tumor is less than 4 centimeters and there is no nodal disease, then we can consider up to in less than 4 centimeter tumor with lymph node metastasis, central nodal dissection should be done. In that case, if it is malignancy or cross extrathyroid extension, in that case, one should go for full dissection or preoperative local metastasis. However, the selectively based tumor focality and size is important to assess the central node dissection. For lateral dissection, one should avoid and should be only done if there's a evidence of disease in the lateral outer neck or level 4 and 5. Otherwise, should be limited to central node dissection. In the intraoperative finding, if the tumor is small and well differentiated and there's no significant node, in that case, one can avoid the central node dissection, only limited to the ipsilateral neck and not the contralateral neck. As we know that if cytologic diagnosis is equivocal, then we should do a thyroglobulin and FNSA washout and make sure that we are not doing extended dissection. We should remember that these young people have a life to live and any morbidity which can be avoided should be avoided. Here, the risk of disease failing is low. In that case, it's not important to do very extensive surgery and avoid anything which is not going to add value. Prophylactic lateral resection is certainly not recommended in any subset of these patients. And the surgery should be limited to high volume surgeons because the morbidity, the stakes are too high. Both the parathyroid and the recurrent nerve are important to be managed and should be carefully dissected and saved. So it is very critical that this should not be done in hands where they're young surgeons or I would say where the experience is limited. And that is very important. Now, once we have done the surgery, in that case, we should rate these patients as low, intermediate, or high group. For the low risk group group of patients, according to American Thyroid Association guidelines, the importance is to keep the TSH level between 0.5 and 1 ml per units per liter, and ultrasound every 6 months for follow-up. Post and annually for 5 years, and thereafter the frequency goes up, and then 2 yearly follow-up is good enough after some time. Now, the important thing is the low risk group is the group which has disease grossly confined to the thyroid and no nodes, significant node or positive node, except incidentally picked up microscopic met in a central nodal lymph node in the neck. The intermediate group is one which has got extensive nodal disease, a minimal N1B disease that is just beyond the neck into the mediastinum and this area. This is the intermediate group. And that is where we want the TSH suppression by raising the dose of thyroxine replacement should be slightly more, so that we are capable to keep the TSH level between 0.1 and 0.5 and does not allow any stimulation for microscopic disease to happen. Here, the follow-up also should be more persistent and careful, and TG level should be monitored for a longer duration of time in this subset of patients. In the high-risk group, that is where there's extensive nodal disease or locally invasive disease, T4 tumor or vocal cord palsy and things like that, there it is important to keep a thorough separation of TSH. We all know that as you give a high dose of altroxin, there is some morbidity related to bone health and other things. So one should be careful on that front and select your group ideally, keep the TSH level under close surveillance and plan accordingly. Again, the ultrasound evaluation at 6 months, postoperative for 5 years is important, every 6 monthly, and then less frequently thereafter. It is important to monitor the thyroglobulin level for 3 years and TSH stimulated scans as and when required, depending on the thyroglobulin levels, the imaging findings, or anything else suspicious of disease. So it is important to categorize your patient and then plan the follow-up accordingly. The replacement therapy should happen according to this. Now, the suppression, as we just discussed, at low risk, the intermediate risk, or high risk, the TSH stimulated thyroglobulin levels should be checked, and TSH level more than 30 is important whenever you are planning a radioiodine scan or post-treatment whole body scan is desirable. We know the side effects of RAI that we'll discuss. I think Dr. Ishita will discuss later, but generally one should be careful in this subset that the cumulative dose is not significant because conadal damage is suspected if it goes beyond a point. Now, the surveillance for TSH stimulated thyroglobulin should be kept in surveillance. The patient should be kept in follow-up. And if it is anything more than 10 nanogram per ml, further evaluation is required, and patients should be kept on close follow-up. The lifelong follow-up, though decreasing intensity, is important for these patients. That means after 5 years, we can step it up to 6 monthly or 1 yearly, and after some time, even 2 yearly. But having said that, the patient should be aware, and this should be under close surveillance with a group of clinicians. They are managing the case. If TG is high and negative ultrasound, then whole body scan should be considered, and that is important. The FDG PET has been studied in adult population, but there are poor studies in the younger age group and should be considered in when TG is high with nothing else showing up as part of the disease. Now, this is how we would suspect when TG is detectable, the neck ultrasound, if done, if positive, FNA has to be done accordingly. If neck ultrasound is not showing up, then radiotherapeutic RAI stimulation and evaluation of the whole body is done. If that is not showing up, in that case, we have to, evaluate according to the, as discussed short while back, that we can do further scanning. The central neck evaluation has to be done, cervical uptake of imaging to identify the resectable disease, and surgical consult. If there's a localized disease, surgery is the mainstay of treatment. Only if it is a metastatic disease, then we consider iodine 131 therapy for this subset of patients. Where it is amenable for surgery, surgery is the main treatment for this disease and should be kept in mind. In iodine 131 refractory disease or asymptomatic or non-productive TSH suppression, this systemic treatment is advisable, but having said that, the options are very, very limited and there's hardly any role in these subset of patients. The follicular CA thyroid in adolescents is less common. It is less so in females compared to males, especially with iodine deficiency or the P10 hematoma syndrome, where it is found. The pediatric follicular thyroid cancer is rare and there's a lot of paucity of data. Again, the surgery is generally total thyroidectomy if it is more than 4 centimeters, node positive, or there's a vascular invasion, which is more than 3 involved nodes. Only in subset of patients where there's a small T1 disease, T2 disease, or minimal invasion, then we consider hemithyroidectomy. The genetic studies should be associated with follicular thyroid cancer, as it should be in medullary and other situations. And we know medullary thyroid cancer is part of these MEN syndrome. And whenever we find medullary CA thyroid, we have to rule out MEN 1, 2, or 3, 2A or 2B. And based on that, a full workup should be done to ensure there is no associated parathyroid tumor, pituitary adenomas, or a insulinoma or a gastrinoma, or as we know for MEN2B, we have to look for mucosal neuromas in the tongue and other areas, which is important. So if I have to say that it is not an uncommon thing. It is something one should be alert, the clinician should be aware, and it should be carefully assessed because it's part of several syndromes. One should look at the total picture and evaluate. Surgery should be done with very careful planning because the surgery morbidity can be long lasting, and one should be careful that these patients have good quality of life for the rest of their lives because they have a good life or the cure rates are very high. And the TSS suppression also should not be blanket or one should not overdo. It should be carefully planned for these patients. So with this, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity and we'll be happy to take questions.
So thank you, and Dr. Chaturvedi. That was indeed a very interesting session. If there are any questions, then they can be placed on the chat box or anybody else.
Can I interact?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Ishita.
Hi,
Hi, Harish.
Yes.
The issue is that as far as the pediatric thyroid cancer is concerned,
yes,
in fact, the earlier teaching which you did mention here was try and see if the nodule is one side, try and see if hemithyroidectomy can be done and all that. But after the Chernobyl accident, which took place, the entire scenario of thought process of pediatric thyroid cancers changed phenomenally because we learned a major important feature from that is all across the pediatric thyroid cancers, irrespective of the size and histology, were highly aggressive. So one needs to have a very aggressive treatment. So this was one of the things which we learned when I was at that time in RMC Tata Hospital. And over a period of almost 38 years, we analyzed and all that. Dr. Samuel, my senior teacher, she published this data on 164 pediatric thyroid cancer. So the current teaching is, unlike what normally we do in other cancers, be as much as possible for pediatric, be a little conservative. That does not hold good in a thyroid cancer, rapid metastasis to lung and lymph node. So my message is in pediatric, kindly be aggressive.
Very important, very important. And total thyroidectomy is the main treatment.
Yes, there
is the main treatment.
Yes, even complete neck dissection. Yeah. Because the pulmonary metastasis may not be seen on a CT or a chest X-ray, but they could be seen on a radioiodine scan.
So the only thing is the lateral dissection should be limited in only if there's a heavy nodal burden in the central area.
Yes,
otherwise,
yes, that point I agree.
Yeah.
I think we'll hear more from Dr. Krishna in his session. I think we can now move on to the next lecture, which is again a very interesting topic. And we all know that the molecular landscape of thyroid cancer is one of the most interesting and evolving topics. And we have none other than Dr. Vijay Lakshmi from Chennai. Dr. Vijay Lakshmi is a professor of molecular oncology at the Adyar Cancer Institute. And welcome, ma'am. And we would...
recording in progress.
So over to you.
Good evening, everybody. I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I'm sharing my screen. So molecular landscape of thyroid cancer. I thank the Teenage and Young Adult Cancer Foundation for giving me this opportunity. Coming to the overview of thyroid cancer types and their origin, thyroid gland has two types of cells, the follicular epithelial cells and the parafollicular cells. And the majority of the cancers we see originate from the follicular epithelial cells, in which we get two types of cancers, mainly the differentiated thyroid cancer and the undifferentiated thyroid cancer. Among the differentiated thyroid cancer, we have the papillary thyroid cancer constituting about 70 to 80% of cases, followed by follicular thyroid 10 to 15% and other thyroid cancers. In the papillary thyroid cancers, we have three varieties, namely the tall cell variant, the classical PTC, and the follicular PTC. In the undifferentiated, the anaplastic thyroid cancer falls under the undifferentiated thyroid cancer, and the parafollicular C cells give rise to medullary thyroid cancer, which is about 5 to 10% of the thyroid cancers. So in the thyroid follicular cells, which gives rise to papillary thyroid cancers and follicular thyroid cancers, there are distinct genetic alterations noticed. In case of papillary thyroid cancers, we have the BRAF mutations constituting about 40 to 50% of cases. And in RAS, is about 15% mutations are seen in the RAS gene. And then we have the RET PTC fusions seen in about 20 to 40% of PTCs, followed by the PAX8 and the PPAR gamma fusion, which is kind of rare in PTC. In the FTC, we have the RAS mutations. Actually, the BRAF and RAS are kind of mutually exclusive. So RAS mutations are seen in about 25 to 40% of cases. And we find a lot of PAX8 and PPAR gamma in about 10 to 66% of cases. And the alterations in the PI3 kinase and AKT pathways are kind of rare. When the PTCs and the FTCs undergo dedifferentiation, they give rise to poorly differentiated thyroid cancers, which accumulate additional genetic alterations, which could be TERT mutations, P53 mutations, and there are other genetic alterations which we will be dealing with in shortly. And from the C cells, there are two types of medullary thyroid we see, sporadic MTCs and the familial MTCs. In the sporadic MTCs, the somatic RET is seen in about 50% of cases, and RAS mutations are seen in about 10 to 40%. Familial MTC, we find germline RET mutations in about 100% of cases. So if you see, there is incremental addition of genetic alterations which keep continuing to happen as the disease progresses in thyroid cancer, and they're very nicely inclined. It's very nicely defined in case of thyroid cancers. So in case of PTCs, you have fusions which occur in the receptor tyrosine kinases, like you have the EML4 ALK fusion, STRN and ALK fusion. Then we have fusion pertaining to NTRK gene, ETV6 and NTRK, RET PTC fusion. So these are the fusions seen in PTC. Then we have the BRAF V600E, TERT mutations, and there is a novel gene which has been identified, that is EIF1AX, which is basically a translation initiation factor. And these are all found in the PTCs. Coming to FTC, we have RAS mutations. Then we have PIK3CA mutations as well as copy number variations, PPAR gamma rearrangements, PTEN deletions, IDH1 mutations, and TERT mutations. So as and when these genetic alterations get added, the tumor becomes poorly differentiated, where we have other gene alterations coming in, like the beta-catenin mutation, P53 mutation, the mismatch repair gene mutation, and these again continue to add up. And as a disease progresses to an undifferentiated state in ATC, we find additional genetic alterations. So there is an incremental addition of genetic alterations, which is to do with the differentiation of the tumor. Now, the survival is kind of good for papillary thyroid and FTC, about 95 to 98 in case of PTC, and FTC about 90 to 95%. But as the disease progresses and becomes poorly differentiated, the survival comes low to approximately 50% in PDTC, and in ATC is less than 10%. So if you look at most of the pathways impact the MAP kinase pathway. In the first type, that is the classical tall cell variant, the BRAF V600E mutation is found in about 60% of the cases. So here, the BRAF, the 600th position, where the valine gets changed to glutamic acid, alters a lot of things in this pathway, because the downstream of BRAF, we find the MEK and then the ERK. The ERK is responsible for a feedback mechanism which can in turn stop the BRAF. But when this BRAF is mutated, what happens is the flux of the MAP kinase is significantly high in case of this, and therefore this mutated BRAF is unresponsive to the feedback mechanism of the EARC. So therefore, this transcriptional program happens at a very high intensity. Whereas if you look at the classical type with RTK fusions, what happens is because the RAF is still wild type here, there is some amount of auto feedback mechanism working here. So therefore, the flux is not so high like what you see for the BRAF V600E. Similarly, even for the follicular, which has the RAS mutations, still this particular signaling is not so much high like what we find for the BRAF V600E. Therefore, BRAF V600E mutation is very, very important in PTC. So therefore, if you are able to inhibit the downstream molecule of BRAF V600E, which is MEK with a inhibitor molecule like selumetinib, what happens is there is an increase of the sodium iodide symporter NIS expression, which increases the iodide uptake. So what you see here is this is an iodine 24 PET CT image of a metastatic lung. Here you find the uptake is very less, but when you treat with a MEK inhibitor and then you take a scan, then the uptake improves. Therefore, it is very important to inhibit the BRAF V600E or the downstream molecules here to kind of increase the iodide uptake in papillary thyroid cancer treatment. So we did a study in our institute where we looked at the BRAF V600E mutation in our series of cases, and we found that our mutation frequency was 39.6%, and it was significantly high in the conventional PTCs. And we also found that patients who were harboring BRAF V600E mutation, they had a significantly poorer disease-free survival. And we also found patients who had both BRAF mutant 600E as well as an extrathyroidal spread, both together. This fraction of patients did the worst. So they were having the highest risk of a poorer disease-free survival compared to patients without extrathyroidal spread and absence of BRAF V600E mutation. That is, in the presence of a wild type and no ETS, the survival is the disease-free survival is about 84.6%. This was very significant. And we also found that the moderate risk is for people with BRAF mutation and no ETS spread, or patients with ETS and no BRAF. So this is what we found in our study. So this is the Kaplan-Meier plot. So what you find is age and the extrathyroidal spread are very important. So you find increased age, that is age greater than 45 years, and patients with extrathyroidal spread did badly. But then when you look at the combination of BRAF mutation with increased age and BRAF mutation with extrathyroidal spread, they are the ones who are having a higher risk towards a poorer disease-free survival. So as we see, we have the follicular thyroid cells. When there is a presence of a BRAF V600E mutation, then it turns into a papillary thyroid cancer. Addition of more genetic alterations, it becomes poorly differentiated. Similarly, in case of the RAS mutations, PI3 signaling or the PTEN loss gives rise to follicular thyroid cancer. Addition of more genetic alterations, it becomes poorly differentiated and then proceeds towards ATC. RET PTC is another important fusion that we see here. So here RET PTC fusion happens in the chromosome 10. So what happens here is there is an inversion. If you see here, there is an inversion of the tyrosine kinase domain, and it happens in such a way that the tyrosine kinase domain is fused to another gene, which is the CCD6 or H4. So therefore, this fusion between the tyrosine kinase of RET and the CCD6 forms the RET PTC1. So like this, you have several partners for the RET PTC, and each of them are important in PTCs. And then you also have, these are all the different donor genes, and these are all the different chromosomal positions. Then another important is the PAX8 PPAR gamma rearrangement. This is the paired box gene 8, that is the PAX8, which is present in the chromosome 2q13, and this is the peroxisome proliferative activated receptor, which we call as PPAR gamma. This is present in the chromosome 3p25. Now, what exactly happens is there is a fusion between the almost whole of the PAX8 with the DNA binding domain and the ligand binding domain of the PPAR gamma to form the PAX8 PPAR gamma fusion protein. Now, this particular translocation is found more in the follicular thyroid cancers. So normal thyroid, when you have excess of the RAS mutation, it becomes follicular thyroid. And in the presence of PAX8 and PPAR gamma fusion also, it can convert into follicular thyroid cancer. Another important player here are the TERT mutations. Now, the TERT is present in it's basically the telomerase gene. So this is present in the 5p15. So what you see a lot of copy number alterations in this TERT locus. And what you see here is the 5p trisomy basically. So normally the mutations happen in the promoter region. When there is a mutation in the promoter region, the transcription factors can come and bind in that region, and the chromatin basically opens up, and there's a constitutive signaling of TERT. And the TERT also gives rise to alternately spliced transcripts as well. So the wild type TERT is normally silenced, whereas in case of mutant TERT, the transcription is constitutive because of the mutation in the promoter region. Now, the BRAF V600 mutation together with TERT is actually a marker for the most aggressive subgroup of PTCs. Now, if you see a study by Zing et al., it shows that patients who had both BRAF and TERT mutations do badly. And so therefore, this is an important parameter that we should study. So this cartoon basically gives most of the genetic alterations, like the mutations in the receptor tyrosine kinase, loss of PTEN, BRAF mutation, RAS mutation, and then the IDH1. This is seen more in the anaplastic. Then this EIF1A6 being involved, TERT mutation, the genes which are involved in the DNA mismatch, and that is the HDAC part, which is important for the increase in the transcriptional activity, P53, and the ones which are involved in cell cycle related players, all these get continuously added, and a lot of genetic alterations are being reported as the tumor progresses and gets more dedifferentiated. This beta-catenin mutation is seen chiefly in the ATCs. So all these genetic mutations can be unraveled with the NGS. NGS is nothing but next generation sequencing, and a lot of work has happened in thyroid cancers because, and this NGS technology is able to improve the diagnostic, especially the diagnosis of the fine needle aspirated cytology of thyroid with indeterminate features. A lot of tests are already available in this front, and NGS has contributed to patient management. It is able to provide better risk stratification of patients based on the risk of malignancy. And NGS has also helped in molecular tumor classification, and predictive markers for recurrence and metastasis have also been reported. So just basically how we go about doing this is we take the genomic DNA or the RNA, which is our sample. So we prepare libraries. In library, what we do is we just add adapters, which are nothing but certain sizes of bases, which will be understood and read by the sequencing machine. So that each of these fragments get a unique identity. So that's what we do in the library preparation. And then that is fed into the NGS machine like Illumina or IronTorrent. And then we read the sequencing, the data which comes out. Now, the advantage of sequencing is that we can do it in multiplexed way. So how we do it in multiplexed way is, now this what you see here is an adapter. I told you every fragment will have an adapter. And in case of adapter, we also add barcodes. Now you have, suppose in this case, you have two barcodes. You have barcode 1 and barcode 2. So for every gene, we'll have about 8 barcode 1 and 12 barcode. So therefore 96 different combinations we can put in one adapter. So this helps in running it in a multiplexed way. So we pool all the barcoded libraries into one tube, and then we can do it as a single multiplexed NGS run, and we can derive data out of it. So this will cut down on the cost and a big deal. So here I'm going to be showing a certain study, but it's a landmark paper by Agarwal et al., which was done on 496 papillary thyroid carcinomas. And this one study they have looked at the mutation, copy number alterations, mRNA expression, miRNA expression, protein expression, DNA methylation. Everything has been studied in one paper. So what the study actually came up with the conclusion that there are two types of signaling. That is, there is a BRAF-like signaling and there is a RAS-like signaling within the PTCs. And then they have also derived a thyroid differentiation score. So based on this, the molecular classification of papillary thyroid cancer is kind of undergoing a small change here, where we are having a BRAF V600E-like papillary carcinoma and a RAS-like papillary carcinoma. And so this is what they showed in this study, and we'll see how they did it. So they've done, they have taken the tumor DNA and RNA and done the entire NGS here. So first panel that you see here is the mutation, that is both synonymous and non-synonymous mutation. And this panel here is based on the plot shows the tumor purity, age, gender. So essentially all the demographic parameters come here. This is based on the MASS score, histologic type, and BRAF RAS score. So this area, these tumors are more of BRAF, and this side you see more of RAS. And what you see here basically are the top significant genes which were derived. So out of the study, the driver mutations of papillary thyroid carcinoma is BRAF, NRAS, HRAS, KRAS, and this EIF1AX. So this is what they say are the drivers which are playing a role. And then essentially, what are the other information we derive out of an NGS work is the fusions. So we were thinking it's only the mutation, but there is also BRAF fusion, which we see. So this is BRAF mutation, BRAF fusion, RET fusion, and these are all the fusions which they obtained in the study. And looking at the copy number alteration, if you see, most of the genome is kind of a silent. In case of a papillary thyroid cancer, if you look at the other cancers NGS data, this copy number alteration plot will be very, very chaotic. Whereas if you see, most of it is very clean because it shows it's completely well differentiated and it's kind of a very silent genome basically. And then this is, if you see what are all the driving variants. So BRAF, RAS are the main driving variants, which is kind of known and expected. So then if you look at what are all the candidate driver fusions in PTCs, now these green domains that you see are the receptor tyrosine kinase, and these are all the different partners. So if you see the red fusion with these partners, then you have the BRAF fusions and then ALK fusions. And if you see, these are called as the Sarkos plots. So which are the red one shows that the translocation is recurrent, and the black one it's non-recurrent. So in NGS data, you can draw Sarkos plots like this, which can give you the map all the driver fusions. And then here, if you see this particular cartoon, it exactly shows you the tumors which were BRAF-like and the RAS-like. So these are all the tumors which harbored BRAF V600E mutation. And then these, the black bars that you see are all the fusions that they have derived. And then clearly, this particular shows you the mRNA clusters, miRNA clusters, DNA methylation clusters. This is based on the protein that is overexpression of, that is differential regulation of proteins, which they have represented here. So everything is represented in one plot here in this. So here, this is an important slide because what they have derived what is called as the thyroid differentiation score based on these genes. And it is a combination of both mRNA and miRNA. So this is a panel here. So if one can study this panel, we will get to know the status of differentiation of the tumor. So for every tumor, if we can do this panel as one test, we can kind of give a score, and it actually gives a lot of information pertaining to the differentiation status. And then rest of the parameters are same. You know, they have shown BRAF, and then the RAS, and then there was a deletion of 22q arm, which they find in this class of PTCs. So if you see the difference here is the BRAF-like tumor is signaling only through the MAP kinase pathway, whereas in case of RAS-like tumors, it is able to signal both via the MAP kinase pathway as well as the PI3 kinase pathway. And it is these mTOR and TSC2, AKT, these are all these significantly upregulated. So therefore, this particular class of tumor will be responsive to mTOR inhibitors. And you also have apoptosis marker shown here. So anti-apoptotic molecules can also be tried for this class of tumors. So basically in this BRAF, it is only MAP. In this, both the pathways are operative. This is essentially the same cartoon, but I just put this because I wanted to show the protein-protein interaction. Yes. So therefore, the take-home message is that there are two different classes, and therefore, and these are the drivers. The similar kind of NGS studies have been done in follicular thyroid, and these are all the different genes which they classify under different titles. So these are all the LOH which they have derived, somatic mutations derived, and based on the panel of genes, one can classify the tumors into the FTC group, low confidence or high confidence. So coming to all this, what is the clinical utility of these markers? The primary aim is that they are being used to test the probability of cancer in thyroid nodules with indeterminate cytology. So for this, there are several ways to go about it. So basically, you take the FNA sample. As it is going for cytologic evaluation, you do a mutational analysis. You kind of derive your nucleic acid, do a mutational analysis, and based on the panels, you kind of decide whether it is malignant or benign, and then you take it forward. So basically, when you see a thyroid nodule, you have to first decide whether it is clonal or non-clonal. So this clonality is something which is derived by a mutation test. So there are different kind of tests which are already there in the market: thyrosequencing, Afirma test, then this ThyGen-X and ThyraMIR. This is a combination of both mRNA and miRNA, Rosetta GX. So these tests are already available and which are being used, and their performance also is being reported here. These are all the different genes, and if you look at the predictive values, it is all there. So what you can do is basically you can have a panel of thyroid cancers, and as the patients are coming with a thyroid nodule, you can do an NGS on that, and then based on the results, you can decide whether it is benign or malignant, and based on the malignancy genes, you can clearly classify them into these categories. And the performance of NGS has also been reported to be quite good. And what they say is, if your thyrosequencing test, which is an NGS test, is negative, the probability of cancer is nearly like 3 to 4%, which is comparable to that of benign cytology. Apart from that, a lot of molecules are already available, which my medical oncologist friends will be talking shortly. So all these receptors are there. So all the molecules which can inhibit the receptors are available. Then similarly, if you look at the downstream pathways, you have a PI3 kinase inhibitor, mTOR inhibitor, vemurafenib, which is a BRAF inhibitor, dabrafenib, then your MEK inhibitors, trametinib, selumetinib, all these are available. So if you can test for these mutations, these drugs can be given. And there are, drugs available for the different fusions also. You have crizotinib for the ALK, and for the RET, you have these molecules. So for every target, there is a drug available nicely for thyroid, which can be explored. Sorry. Yeah. So summary and conclusion, molecular markers can be very useful to evaluate the thyroid tumor growth and progression. It's useful in classification of thyroid tumor subtypes. It can help in prediction of disease outcome, and it can also aid in development of systemic molecular therapies using the molecules that we just saw, especially in cancers that are refractory to standard treatment. So I'm happy to support as a molecular biologist. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was indeed a very interesting talk. And I think this is the way thyroid cancer treatment, especially the ones which are radioactive iodine refractory. And we are seeing more and more of them nowadays. And I think this is where the future of treatment of such disease is going to go. Are there any questions? Anybody would like to interact? So maybe
one point is that unlike in the adult thyroid cancers, where the BRAF and mutations are much more commoner, the pediatric do not seem to show that. They're often RET. Am I right?
Yes. We could actually start. I'm not sure if there are any Indian studies where they have done NGS on the pediatric thyroid. So probably a study can be done because,
correct.
Yeah. So if we initiate such studies, we will begin to understand the molecular portrait of these cancers better, and we will be able to come up with more targeted therapies for them.
Possibly because most of the pediatric thyroid cancers are responsive to iodine, and they are iodine sensitive. Despite having large volume disease, usually the pediatric population does very well with radioactive iodine. So
At least the BRAF V600E testing will be important, because if that is going to be mutant, then it's going to become refractory.
Yes.
So at least that can be done. It's very easily done by PCR, and then there is also a mutant antibody available. So we have published a paper on that as well, where the PCR and the IHC compares very well. So at least that can always be done. Mutant antibodies available, IHC can be done to understand whether it is mutation positive.
So coming to the, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And I don't see any questions on the chat box. So maybe we can go on to the next topic, and we have.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. So we have Professor B.A. Krishna, who's been a teacher to most of us, and a nuclear medicine physician par excellence, one of the most experienced people in the field. And he now heads the nuclear medicine department at the Leelavati Hospital. So over to you, sir. And he's going to be talking about the radioiodine therapy in patients of differentiated thyroid cancer and beyond.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Right. To Holy Grail is an interesting word. So far as radioiodine concerned, I'm sure nobody would like to have that. But however, this subgroup of patients, it would act as a Holy Grail. From that point of view, I think it's an interesting topic. To those of you who may not be knowing, the radioiodine was given to the world by Professor Seeberg way back in 1938, and for which he got a Nobel Prize. And in 1950 was the first thyroid scan done by Professor Benedict Casson. And this is the thyroid scan that you see on the screen. And after that, the famous Nobel Prize was given to the radioimmunoassay T3, T4, TSH, which revolutionized the endocrinology and thyroidology in particular. These I considered as the greatest contribution to science, because imaging in clinical medicine started with these stalwarts. Now, coming to the thyroid cancers, much has been spoken. Why do we need to look to the pediatric cancers in a different way than the adult cancer? Is an issue which the American Thyroid Association group took to itself, and the reason they put were 4 or 5. The first one is that a nodule in a pediatric child has a more propensity to thyroid cancer than an adult. The incidence wise may be 25% in pediatrics, 10% in the adult. Secondly, when you take the histology and the tumor size, which are the critical factors for our classification, in pediatric setting, irrespective of the size and the pattern, the manifestations seem to be aggressive. That is why it appears to be behaving slightly different. Number 3, these children, though they have an extensive disease, after treatment, they do not die like what the adult patients do who have extensive meds. That means for some reason, they continue with a stable disease for years and years. That is another important feature from adult cancer. Fourth is, the most important is that molecular profile. The BRAF profile, which she mentioned just now, is not commonly seen in pediatric setting. It is the RAT. So the RET, R-E-T. Because of that, it appears that the patients live for a long time, unlike the adults where the mutations are BRAF mutations, where the prognosis is poor. From this histological perspective point, pediatric thyroid cancers are different from the adult cancer. The American Thyroid Association took to this issue and tried to find out, are we going to have a guideline different from an adult cancer, or what am I supposed to do? As of now, the recommendations are still not concrete, but there are certain amounts of thought processes going on at various levels. Nonetheless, as far as the treatment is concerned, surgery, radioiodine, thyroid hormone, and of late, targeted therapy is what is in the adult group. With regard to the targeted therapy in a pediatric setting, it is very difficult to make any recommendation or comment because we do not have sufficient data. I, on my own, after I came out of the Tata Hospital, in the last 22 years, I have seen only 3 pediatric cancers. Interestingly, all of them coming from Afghanistan and staying very close to Russia. So obviously they had some sort of a Chernobyl impact on them. Now, coming to the concept of radioiodine, which emits gamma and the beta rays. The beta rays have therapeutic effect and are used in treatment both of thyrotoxicosis and cancer. The thyroid follicle traps the radioiodine and during its stay in the follicle delivers radiation dose which has either a partial or a complete ablation of the disease. So this important concept of the papillary and follicular thyroid cancers and some of the HER2 cell cancers maintaining this physiological property is one of the most important concepts in radioiodine for thyroid cancer. So this concept was enunciated by Professor Saul Hertz from MIT, who is credited for using radioiodine for the first time in thyroid disorders, both in thyrotoxicosis and thyroid cancer. In fact, that was the birth of nuclear therapy. 1943 was the first patient treated with radioiodine of extensive thyroid cancer metastasis. And this patient, who had done well after surgery for 20 years, had an extensive meds with radioiodine, went on to live 8 years more, eventually succumbed to conversion of the thyroid cancer to anaplastic carcinoma. That was the first report, and the entire US papers had put a caption, "The atom cures the atom." So that sort of a interesting captions were put at that time. So when do we take the role of radioiodine in thyroid cancer? It is always after total thyroidectomy. It cannot be taken when you do a hemithyroidectomy or a nodulectomy. Why do we do that? Because when you remove the whole thyroid, then only we'll have the capacity to pick up the metastatic disease. Number 2, near total thyroidectomy enhances the survival rate. Majority of the children glands are having multiplicity of the disease. So total thyroidectomy becomes mandatory. Post-operative follow-up becomes extremely scientific if you do total thyroidectomy. And success rate of ablation is excellent when you finish total thyroidectomy and treat occult disease. In the post-surgery workup, both as far as pediatric, as far as adult, both are, as of now today, we continue the same algorithm or same guideline. The TSH level has to increase to 30 to 40, has to be measured. Stimulated thyroglobulin has to be measured. And one addition that has come, even in children, is anti-thyroglobulin antibody levels have to be measured. In the whole body radioiodine scan for almost 3 decades, we were only having one protocol. 4 weeks to achieve a TSH of 40, which enhances the pickup of metastasis on the iodine scan. Of late, in the adult scenario, our TSH protocol, recombinant human TSH protocol, has been brought where the recombinant human TSH is given in the form of injections and it produces high TSH value, and you can perform both the diagnostic scan and the treatment. Its role in pediatric setting is not yet completely understood, nor has a recommendation come. One important change that has taken place after the last 3 decades is we have now got to do what is called as post-surgical, not pre-surgical. Pre-surgical classification is already done. Post-surgical classification is the critical determinant of all the future treatment approaches. All patients who are classified as low risk may not need this sort of high radiation treatment, whereas the intermediate and the high risk group, based upon the factors that are mentioned here, all of them will need a radioactive iodine workup followed by therapy depending upon the findings. So crux of the issue is, please risk stratify the patient After full histology has come in a post-op scenario, then take your decision. So in the post-surgical evaluation, the main aim is to see whether, especially in a pediatric, because as I said, a high multicentricity. And number two, there is a high incidence of 45% lung metastasis. Bone mets are 29%. Especially in a pediatric setting, 8 to 10% of the pulmonary metastases are occult, not seen on chest X-ray, not seen on CT. Hence, it becomes mandatory to restage the patient after surgery using radioiodine. For this particular whole body scan, critical issue is patient should not have any organic iodide in the body. If he has taken any iodide, the radioiodine will not enter into the cells by a process of competitive inhibition, and you will neither be getting a scan nor you will achieve a radioiodine treatment. So the whole body radioiodine scan, the prerequisites are total thyroidectomy, confirmed histology of differentiated cancer, TSH level 40, patient should be off thyroxine, pregnancy should, but in a pediatric scenario, we don't bother about this. It is imperative that you measure both thyroglobulin and antithyroglobulin test along with whole body iodine scan. The recombinant TSH is a technique which we use in the adolescents and in the adult group, where it induces a rise in endogenous TSH without the need to stop thyroxine treatment. Thereby, this technique is very patient-friendly. The whole procedure finishes in about 6 to 10 days, diagnostic scan and treatment. Whereas in the withdrawal of thyroxine protocol, it goes on for 4 to 5 weeks. That is the major issue that is confronting us in a very rapidly growing and very active society. There are 2 injections given, day 1 and day 2, and then the radioiodine scan dose is given. On the 3rd day and 6th day, you do the whole body scan. And on day 1, you measure the TSH. Day 2 and day 3, it goes to 83 to 150. And by the 6th day, it will come down to 59 to 70. The thyroglobulin, which is 4,000 in the beginning, if it would jump to 7,400 by the time the scan comes because of the high TSH stimulation. Now, this technique I introduced in 2003 when I was at Hinduja Hospital, and today at Bombay, we are doing it as a routine in affording patients. It's extremely expensive. 89,000 rupees is the cost of the injection. So we have to be very careful in putting this across to the patients. This is an iodine scan where you see a neck tissue which is present after surgery. There is also pulmonary metastasis, and you see activity in the bowel. Now, this is a scan which is done at 5th or 6th day. Along with the scan, we measure thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin does not have a role in the pre-surgical scenario. It is only in the total thyroidectomized patient or athyrotic patient, the thyroglobulin gets a very high sensitive value in terms of disease presence, disease absence, or disease recurrence. So thyroglobulin forms the core of investigation throughout the life of that particular individual. It is not specific marker of thyroid CN. It can be thyroiditis, it can be other conditions. TG plasma concentration correlates with the mass of the tumor. In an athyrotic patient, less than 2 nanogram is acceptable. Any post-treatment elevation of thyroglobulin always indicates either a remnant thyroid tissue or a metastatic disease anywhere in the body, and it is the best marker during the follow-up. Anti-thyroglobulin antibody is mandatory estimation along with the whole body iodine scan. You will get a low, false, negative TG value when the anti-thyroglobulin antibody is high, because the antibodies mop up the thyroglobulin and everything gets stuck to the antibody. So high anti-thyroglobulin antibody, low thyroglobulin means there is a disease similar to what a high thyroglobulin. Hence, it is important to estimate this. There's a question that is being raised today. Should we have an anti-thyroglobulin antibody prior to surgery? very important question that was answered recently, because when these antibodies are present prior to surgery, they hang on in the blood for an year, sometimes even go to 18 months. So the relevance of that becomes difficult if you do not have a pre-surgical antithyroglobulin antibody. And I think in this scenario, we from India need to contribute a data if we have done in pre-surgical scenario. This is one important scan. You can see only antithyroglobulin antibody was high, thyroglobulin was negative, and you are seeing nodules in the lung, which are picking up the radioiodine. And so all these antithyroglobulin antibody raised negative TG patients concentrate very well, and but response is not as strong as those who have TG high values. So therapy is done in terms of ablating the residual tissue post-surgery or a treatment of metastatic disease. Today, we give this radioactive as a pill, which the BARC produces in India. We are very proud of that because no country, majority of the countries import. And this is given in India through the capsule. And also it can be given in liquid format. At Mumbai, in the Raheja Hospital, where we have the neuroendocrine and neuroendocrine cancer therapy center, we use the liquid isotope for therapy purpose, and the patient is admitted in the ward for 2 to 3 days. The medication is given orally. The treatment is repeated every 9 months if there is a disease. Lymph node and lung mets show good response, while bone shows suboptimal response. Even in pediatric setting, the same scenario happens. There's not much difference in terms of the response rate, but the progression of disease is faster in the adults, much less in the pediatric setting. I'm just showing you an example here. This is a post-op residual tissue in the neck, and it has been ablated with a small dose of 50 millicurie, and the entire thing has got ablated in one sitting. This is another patient where you see a residual tissue, but here the antithyroglobulin antibody was very high, TG was low. However, we went ahead and treated this patient and he achieved a complete ablation. In the metastatic setting, lungs, visceral, bone, and brain, this is a beautiful case for you to illustrate the role of surgery. This is a patient who was asymptomatic. Total thyroidectomy was done, an Afghan child. You look at this patient, chest X-ray is negative, CT is negative, but what you are seeing is extensive radioiodine uptake in bilateral lungs with 2 small nodules on the top. Now, when you treat this patient at this stage, when there is no structural lesion on the CT or the chest X-ray, the complete ablation of metastasis is around 70 to 80%. In 1984, at the UICC Congress, I presented the data of 1,100 patients from the Tata Memorial, which we compared with the MD Anderson group in terms of occult pulmonary metastatic disease. Our incidence was 6.4, whereas the MD Anderson was 8.2. They had an ablation rate of 80%. We had an ablation rate of 64%. So occult pulmonary metastasis, if I have to pick up, you have got to have a total thyroidectomy. If you do not do that, then we'll miss these occult lesions, and we will treat them only when they become nodular. If you very carefully see this scan, in the CT scan, the 2 nodules which are seen, they have not responded well in the post-treatment scan, whereas the diffuse pulmonary metastasis has completely got ablated. This is a classical slide to teach the necessity of doing a good total thyroidectomy for an excellent outcome. When you have a large metastasis, be it a pediatric child or an adult child, here you can see the radioiodine uptake is there in the pelvic area, and there is in the neck, also in the ribs. But this large lesion was showing so high uptake, and I said, this guy is not going to get ever treated. So I sent him for surgery, and the whole mass was removed after completely removing the mass with a residual tissue. I have treated this patient. Now, after the 3rd therapy, he's almost almost about 10% disease in his body. So large lesions, we must get surgery back into picture. The same thing you see here, a large iliac metastasis, which had to be excised, and a very little tissue left that could be taken care with radioiodine. The complications of radioiodine are radiation thyroiditis, edema. I saw when I was treating this pediatric group at the radiation center at Tata, the most commonest thing we developed there was sialadenitis because the child were not cooperating. We never got a hemorrhage in a tumor, but one of the major problems which came at that time was in a pediatric setting, radiation pneumonitis. So later on, when we analyzed the data, which is a published data in the Journal of Nuclear Medicine 20 years ago, you can well read that, and we have shown there that the incidence of radiation pneumonitis or interstitial pulmonary disease did not increase in all those children who got radioiodine, but they got ablated very well. And in fact, almost 30 to 40% of these children are still alive, with some of them with the disease. So one of the factors in the pediatric scenario of that interstitial lung disease need not be a major concern in a pediatric setting. There is no major documented complications in a young lady of pregnancies, or is there a proof that there is a second malignancies come. In my data of 1,000 patients, I got 6 patients of breast cancer, 2 patients of bladder cancer, 1 patient of stomach cancer. These are all the areas where the radioiodine normally accumulates. But this incidence was not more than what the literature did in the common scenario. So obviously saying radioiodine does not produce second malignancies. What is the impact? So many people have tried to compare thyroid hormone treatment versus radioiodine. And what you see in this curve is classically, you can see the lower curve of thyroxine with radioiodine gives fabulous survival data compared to thyroxine or no radioiodine. It's a very clear-cut difference between the two. And this is once again showing the same, that cancer death rates after thyroid remnant ablation is hardly any if you give radioiodine, and if you do not, there is an increased risk of thyroid cancer. Overall survival also now has been documented to be much, much superior in radioiodine treated patients. The follow-up protocol is that after the ablation is done, 6 to 12 months later, you do what is called as stimulated thyroglobulin. Without stimulated thyroglobulin, the detection rate is less. So please remember this word, stimulated thyroglobulin, that is TSH stimulated, and neck ultrasound. If stimulated thyroglobulin is more than 2 nanograms, no abnormalities on neck ultrasound, just follow and clearly yearly evaluate. If it is less than 2 nanograms. If it is above 2 nanograms, you have got to make a full workup. Radioiodine scan should not be brought all the time in the follow-up. It is only when clinically there is a suspicion or the ultrasound raises a suspicion and the scan shows only neck disease, they may go back to surgery and not to radioiodine treatment. Like that, today, there is a rearrangement of therapeutic protocol. We have now a new group of disease called tennis syndrome, thyroglobulin elevated negative iodine scan. I won't speak much of this because we have the next person talking on this. Here, what happens is the sodium iodide symporter, which is essential to push the radioiodine into the follicle, is not functioning. That is because of the BRAF mutation and the TERT mutation, which make this function loss. As a result of this function loss, radioiodine does not go into the patient, into the cell. One nice case of my patient, you can see on the neck tissue, I ablated, he concentrated very well, 32 nanogram. Then we came 9 months later for follow-up. The scan showed no uptake. Thyroglobulin was 8 nanogram. This was a negative iodine scan. But I thought that he had some sort of iodine issue. We waited, repeated the scan 6 months later. TG had gone to 14 and iodine scan was negative. Ultrasound picked up 4 lymph nodes in the neck, which Dr. Pradhan operated upon all were metastatic. So this is a negative iodine scan. This is another patient coming from Kenya who has an anti-thyroglobulin antibody high, but TG negative, and you show a high intense uptake, and she has got completely ablated after this therapy. In a radioiodine resistant thyroid cancers, persistent symptomatic metastasis, even after treatment to 600 millicurie over 2 years, is a resistant to radioiodine disease. Absence of uptake, of course, will be resistant. Thyroglobulin has to be elevated in both of these settings to call them as radioiodine resistant cancers. I'm showing you one patient here, bone metastasis, not responding to 600 millicurie. Even today, the patient is not in a good shape because he didn't respond. And this is another patient negative with thyroglobulin and radioiodine negative. So what do we do? Is there a role of FDG PET scan in thyroid cancer? Is a question commonly asked. In a conventional scenario, no role at all. But when it mutates, when it becomes radio resistant, in that scenario, FDG PET is mandatory. And as you see here, small diseases which you saw in the mediastinum, one of our patients shows that there are multiple neck and mediastinal metastases. So that is an important point. Sorry. Finally, in all these patients, they are going to go for targeted therapy, of which you will be hearing in the next lecture. What are the future trends we may come across? My youngsters who are in the audience, they may not do this, they may not see these scans. You may see what is called a thyropet, PET scan of the thyroid, which is coming with radioiodine 124, which will be a phenomenal scanning technique for various reasons which are mentioned here. I won't go into much detail. I'll just show an example here. An FDG PET scan negative and iodine 124 PET scan showing excellent. Why do we need that scan? The resolution of PET scan will be very high and we'll stage the disease excellent way. I-124 PET scan. There is a new concept of redifferentiating a undifferentiated cell back into differentiated by using some of the drugs called trametinib. The PET scan is an excellent tool, iodine 124, to demonstrate how the redifferentiation occurs. This science is evolving. Radioiodine treatment has stood the test of time for 70 years, and I have been a part of this journey for the last 40 years. It has been a great journey for me. Finally, I want to close the talk with this fabulous slide. Interesting endocrinologist at Boston Medical Center made a major study of putting dogs, training them, and can they sniff a thyroid cancer? This is very odd stuff. And look at the sensitivity and specificity, very high. So I was wondering, a day will come where I'll go to my clinic with my dog and keep them sitting in the thyroid clinic, and that's what's going to happen. This is a metastatic cat treated after radioiodine therapy becoming excellent. Thank you with that particular slide.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. I think, as always, your talks are not just enlightening, but always inspiring to, especially to youngsters.
Thank you.
If there would be any questions, I don't see any questions in the chat box either. So we'll thank you, sir.
Thank
you. We'll go on to the last talk of the evening, and that is a very important part, which is becoming more and more important these days with the advent of radioiodine negative thyroid cancer, or rather radioiodine refractory thyroid cancer. And we have none other than Dr. Jayachandran from Chennai, who's going to be talking about systemic therapy of metastatic thyroid cancer. So over to you, Dr. Jayachandran.
Good evening, everyone. So good evening to everyone. So I thank the Daiken Foundation and Dr. Prakash Stalkar for giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about systemic therapy in metastatic thyroid cancer. So these are my disclosures. and a warm greetings from Cancer Institute, Adaya, Chennai. And my talk, the agenda would be about the GloboCan 2020 data, how about the data from the AYA thyroid cancers in the West, then a little data about thyroid cancers from India, and then my systemic topic per se about the systemic therapy in metastatic thyroid cancers, about the RET inhibitors, and next on the other agents. So I am being the tail ender of this conference, and also in metastatic thyroid cancers also medical oncologist role is going to be a tail ender, and I'll show why I'm telling this. So regarding the GloboCan 2020 data, the worldwide thyroid cancers has about 10th place in the terms of incidence and 25th place in terms of mortality. Whereas in India, it is in 19th place in terms of incidence and 25th place in terms of mortality. About 20,400 cases were diagnosed in 2020. About 5,000 cases died of thyroid cancers in 2020. This is a burden of thyroid cancers worldwide. And regarding the AYA thyroid cancers in the West, this is the data from US published in 2017. About it constitutes about 7% of the pediatric malignancies, and it is the #1 incident cancer in the US in the SEER database about in the age group of 16 to 33 years. And there's no major change in mortality over years. And you could see in this graph that there's a very high incidence and creeping incidence in the past couple of decades of the thyroid cancers in the AYA population. And you can see that about 40% difference between the incidence of thyroid cancers, and the second most common is the gonorrheal germ cell tumors. The incidence difference is about 40%, which is huge. And hence why this thyroid cancers has come into the limelight more and more in the AYA population. And this is the data from Canada. This is the data from 1992 to 2010, and it included patients less than 30 years. And in this, patients between 17 to 30 years, that's what AYA population constituted about 2,358 patients. In this, about only 15 deaths were recorded in the study period. And this was the most common cancer among the AYA population, which is mentioned. And the male to female ratio, obviously females had a higher incidence. And you can see that only 15 deaths out of 2,500 recorded in this period. And this were not mentioned, any death, disease, DFS and OS were not analyzed in this data. This is the data from Denmark, less than 25 years of age, about 1980 to 2014. The median age was 21 years in 297 patients, of which the 18 to 24 years, the AYA populations, it was 211 patients. The median follow-up was 15.4 years. The 15-year OS was 99%. The 15-year OS of differential thyroid cancers were 100%, and 15 years OS of medullary thyroid cancers were 96%. And coming on to data from India regarding the AYA cancers, this is a publication from TMH Mumbai, which had about 30 years of data in patients less than 17 years. The numbers were 57. The median follow-up of 64 months, the 5-year DFS was 82.4, and 5-year OS was 100%. And this is the data from AIIMS New Delhi, about 25 years data with the age of less than 20 years. The 16 to 20 years constituted about 52 patients. The DFS at the end of median follow-up of 72 months was 82.4, and the OS was 100%. And this is the data from our own institute, Cancer Institute Chennai. About this data constituted about 20 years of data, and less than 21 years were included. The numbers were 67 patients and 18 years with the median age. And about 15 to 21 years in this population was about 70%, 47 patients. The median follow-up was 4 months. The 10-year DFS was 81.4%, and 10-year OS was 100%. All these data which I mentioned, the OS was absolutely more than 99%. Almost all patients survived more than 10 years. This is the reason why the role of medical oncologist is a tail ender in this group of population. All these data which I had presented was from the era where TKIs was not there. So even though that AYA cancers, as mentioned by the speakers, are more aggressive. They tend to have a good and excellent survival. But most of them have a 10-year or 15-year OS of 100% with only the radioiodine ablations. And the role of medical oncologist comes somewhere later in their life when they cross the AYA age and they will step on to the early 40s or late 30s. When that is a time when they have recurrences and they may need medical oncologists to work on them. So coming on to my topic per se, the systemic therapy, the RET inhibitors is the cornerstone in the treatment of the thyroid cancers, both differentiated and the medullary thyroid cancers. Just regarding this, Dr. Vijayalakshmi has given a great, excellent landscape of what is happening in the RET, BRAF, TERT, and other mutations in cancers. And the most common one is the alterations in RET. If you look at the RET fusions in differentiated thyroid cancers, about 10 to 20% have differentiated RET fusions in papillary thyroid cancer. And the most common fusion partners are being CCD, C6, and NCA4. And regarding the RET mutations, the hereditary medullary thyroid cancers have more than 90%, which are associated with MEN2A and MEN2B syndromes. And the sporadic MTCs in that, more than 60% have RET mutations. This is why the RET is the most commonly targeted gene in thyroid cancers. So let us look at the various drugs approved in thyroid cancers, RET inhibitors. These are Vantinib was approved for medullary thyroid cancer in 2011. Cabozantinib was approved for medullary thyroid cancer in 2012. And of recently, it has been approved a couple of days back. It was approved in differentiated thyroid cancer recently. And Sorafenib was the first drug which was approved in differentiated thyroid cancer in 2013. Lenvatinib was approved in 2015 in differentiated thyroid cancer. The Selpercatinib and Pralsetinib are the recent drugs in 2020 approved in RET mutant medullary thyroid cancers. So let us go into the drugs. So one disclaimer which I need to mention is most of these studies which have been conducted on these drugs have been conducted more commonly in adults, and the amount of TYA population in this group is very less, because as I mentioned that most of the patients who are diagnosed in the AYA age group go into the adult age group more than 40 years to become radioiodine resistant cancers, and then only the role of medical oncologists come over there. So this is a first study which is on the differentiated thyroid cancers, the Decision trial. This was Sorafenib versus placebo in patients who are locally advanced or metastatic differentiated thyroid cancer, who are radioiodine refractory and they did not have any prior targeted therapy or chemotherapy. So they were randomized to Sorafenib versus placebo. The crossover was allowed in progression in patients who had placebo. The median age was 63 years, whereas but included 19 to 78 years. It showed a PFS benefit. About hazard risk was 41% reduction in the risk of progression, but there was no overall survival benefit. Median PFS had a benefit. So this was the first drug which was approved. And coming on the next study, this is a select study which is on Lenvatinib. This included about 392 patients who are iron refractory patients who had one prior VEGF therapy, and patients who had randomized in a 2:1 patient from Lenvatinib versus placebo. The PFS was primary endpoint, and it also included Lenvatinib for patients who had got placebo after progression. The median age, again, it is 64 years in this Lenvatinib and 61 years in the placebo arm. This also was most commonly in the adult population. And if you look at the primary endpoint, the PFS, here you can see the prior VEGF target therapy. About 25% of the patients had prior targeted VEGF therapy. And this primary endpoint, the PFS was 0.21 with hazard, which is excellent, about 80% reduction in the risk of progression and death. So this was an excellent survival PFS benefit, whereas there was no overall survival benefit because of the crossover which was allowed. The overall response also excellent, 65 versus 2%. So with this, the Lenvatinib was the most preferred drug, which was preferred over Sorafenib because of the amount of benefit which has shown. So it is the most preferred drug, and the toxicity profiles comparing to sorafenib is also better with lenvatinib. So lenvatinib is more preferred for first-line therapy in differentiated thyroid cancer than sorafenib. Then of recent, this is a cabozantinib, which was approved in differentiated thyroid cancer. Cabozantinib was approved just on September 22, just a couple of days back. It was approved based on the COSMIC 311 study. It also included radioiodine refractory disease, and patients up to 2 prior lines of VEGF therapy was allowed. So patients had even 2 lines, sorafenib and lenvatinib also was allowed. So it was 2:1 patient randomization, cabozantinib versus placebo. And like a second line therapy, it is included age more than 16 years also. So coming on to the median age, again, the median age was 65 years, which included 32 to 85 years. And prior lenvatinib, over 60% of the patients had prior lenvatinib. And if you look at the PFS, the hazard risk was 0.22. So it's a placebo-controlled trial. Obviously, there will be an excellent benefit. So about 80% reduction in death and progression. So this showed a phenomenal improvement in the PFS in second-line therapy. So this is the new standard of care for second-line therapy in differentiated cancer after lenvatinib progression. And also there was a trend towards overall survival benefit in this population. The objective response rate was also present, 50% versus 0%. And this is a new second-line therapy which has been approved in differentiated cancer. And coming on to the medullary thyroid cancers, there are multiple drugs which have been approved in this setting. And first drug which was approved is vandetanib in locally advanced and medullary thyroid cancer. This trial included about 331 patients. The median age again was 50 years, which included the lowest stage group was 19 years. 90% were sporadic and 95% were metastatic disease. And the median follow-up of this study was 24 months. The hazard risk for PFS was 0.46, about 54% reduction in the risk of progression or death. So it showed a PFS benefit. There was overall response rate was also better with vandetanib, and biochemical response rate, the serum calcitonin reduction was also better with vandetanib. So this was approved based on this trial in 2011. And this is another drug which is a retimilor, which is cabozantinib. It also was approved in medullary thyroid cancer way back in 2012 based on this trial, which showed an excellent PFS benefit of about 70% reduction in risk of progression or death. And based on this trial, cabozantinib was approved in medullary thyroid cancer. And of recently, a couple of drugs, pralsetinib and selpercatinib, which are RET fusion inhibitors, have been approved in medullary thyroid cancers. This ARROW study is a phase 1 by phase 2 study. This is a registration study. Based on a phase 2 study, the approval has come for pralsetinib in 2020. The median age in this group was 50 years. We can clearly see the waterfall plot that most of the patients had an excellent response to this inhibitor and who had already received vandetanib or cabozantinib. So this is a second-line therapy. Again, a second-line therapy, pralsetinib has shown excellent response rates, and it is well tolerated as oral once oral treatment. And this is a study, Liberto study. This is on selpercatinib in RET-altered thyroid cancers. That is, again, we can see the median age of 57 years in this population, and the median PFS was not reached. And in this patients also, you can see the waterfall plot showing that there is excellent patient survival benefit post second line. So excellent response rate in patients who had already received vandetanib or cabozantinib or both vandetanib and cabozantinib. And these are better, and the duration of response was not reached, and PFS was not 1 year. PFS was 82%, and this also shows excellent response rates in second line treatment after usage of vandetanib or cabozantinib in RET mutant medullary thyroid cancers. So let us move to the next part of my talk is systemic therapy and other agents. Other agents which are approved for the tumor agnostic therapies in patients with NTRK fusion positive, the larotrectinib has been approved based on the NAVIGATE study, which I will be dealing with in the next slides, where the entrectinib has been approved for NTRK fusion positive. thyroid cancers in patients with TMB mutation, TMB high, that is more than 10 mutations for base pairs. Pembrolizumab has been approved based on the Keynote 158 study. About 2 to 3 patients were included in the study with thyroid cancers. In BRAF V600 mutant, dabrafenib with trametinib has been approved as a half-label indication, and in MSI, pembrolizumab has been approved. So other agents, chemotherapy plays a very little role in the thyroid cancers. Most of its role is in anaplastic thyroid cancers. The combination of 5-FU dacarbazine, doxorubicin, streptozotocin, acticarbo, docetaxel, all these agents have very little role. And also in patients, it is for anaplastic thyroid carcinoma, it has been used for as a radiosensitizing agent with RT. So most of common anaplastic thyroid cancers are very rarely seen in this AY age group. Most commonly it is seen in a very elderly age group only. So, and again, supportive care, denosumab and bisphosphonates in bone mets are a part of a role in other. Regarding the Navigate study, advanced thyroid cancer, about 28 patients were included in the study and more than 12 years. And the primary best object, the median time to response was 1.29 months and the median voice was 27.8 months. Based on this study, laratriptan has been approved for NTRK fusion positive and advanced thyroid cancers. I think, thank you very much for the opportunity and tributes to our former chairman, Padma Vibhushan, Dr. V. Shanta. Thank you everyone for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Jayachandran. There is a question in the chat box which says that, is there any role of steroids in elevated thyroglobulin antibody with normal thyroglobulin? I think this is directed to Dr. Jayachandran or anybody else who would like to answer this.
So basically, in we give steroids for patients who have autoimmune thyroiditis with anti-thyroglobulin positive antibodies. But in this role, I think Dr. Krishna sir is a better person to answer because I do not deal with the patients with thyroglobulin antibodies prior to radioactive.
Actually, what is the important point here? It's a very important point actually. What they say, along with when you do these antibodies, we are doing the TG antibodies, one scenario. You also do the other antibodies. Supposing you have other antibody values also very high, then you attribute this TG antibody to that probable pathology like associated thyroiditis, and maybe steroid might bring it down. But there is no strong data on that at all because number of cases are very less in that scenario. Actually, I want to make one, Ishita, an important point here, which Harish brought out in the beginning. When we have a hot nodule on a thyroid scan, Harish is there? Okay. A hot nodule on the thyroid scan, we invariably say malignancy is ruled out. So we do not go into the FNAC. But in a pediatric scenario, one of the suggestions made is if the toxic nodule is one which has been growing rapidly in the last 4 or 6 months, number one, and number two, in all pediatric toxic nodules, they are going for hemithyroidectomy rather than for radioiodine. So FNAC is recommended even in a toxic nodule setting, number one, in pediatric patient. In the adult scenario, often as you saw his algorithm, if it is hyperfunctioning, it stopped there because it goes to radioiodine treatment. But there are cases of papillary thyroid cancer associated with the toxic nodule. Now why I brought that issue is thyroiditis background is seen in the background of these people. And all of them are showing TG antibodies high. So if you see all antibodies raised, probably steroid may be given and reassess the antibody.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, that there is almost I think about 15% risk of malignancies in toxic nodules, especially in the pediatric age group. And the old algorithm of not FNACing the hot nodules is probably not. So we have to take the ultrasound characteristics, as well as keep a very high index of suspicion for malignancy in any child presenting with a nodule in the thyroid. So I think if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Dr. Jayachandran for an excellent talk, and hand over back to the organizers.